just pick one game as the most pivotal game right here. I posed the question to Gators Breakdown Plus members earlier today. Well, I'll get into their thoughts too, because I knew this was going to be varied response here. Personally, for me, it's always Georgia. That's just my personal one. But we got to realize where Florida is right now, where Georgia is right now. But also, I mean, zooming out, what is the most pivotal game for this team, this 2024 team? What game do they have to win for a successful season? There's many options here, I think, when you look at it. There's Miami, there's UCF, Tennessee, Georgia, Texas, LSU, FSU. However you want to look at it, whether it's rivalries, whether it's in-state teams, whether it's highly ranked teams, those scenarios are there for you to be the most pivotal opponent that Florida has on the 2024 schedule. Will, do you want me to go first? Do you want to go first? How do you want to do this one?
Let's see what you got.
Okay.
What's your opinion here?
Not trying to make the headlines here or anything like that. I'm going Kentucky. Kentucky's the most pivotal game for me for the 2024 Gators because just think about it. This game has meant the last couple of years that Florida wasn't going to have a very good team. It was an indicator of the team Florida was going to have the last few seasons, last couple seasons specifically, because Kentucky was 7-6, Will, the last couple of seasons. These weren't good Kentucky teams that were beating Florida the last 2 years. They haven't beaten a good Florida team since 2018. You got to go back 3 years ago when also Kentucky went 10-3, but still not beating a good Florida team. 2018 was the last time both teams were good, and Kentucky got that win that broke the 33-year streak that Florida had. But 2 years ago, Kentucky went 10-3, but still not beating a good Florida team. The last 2 years, not beating a good Florida team. They haven't been that great either. So, while Kentucky, they certainly have taken steps under Mark Stoops, the only good Florida team they have beaten was in 2018. So, to me, what this game has signified is what type of season Florida is going to have. It is a bit different this season, Will, because the Kentucky game comes mid-season. Kentucky doesn't have all offseason to start with to play cupcakes and prepare for Florida all offseason. We'll have an idea of what both teams are heading into this year's matchup. But if recent history is any indication, if Florida loses this game to the Wildcats, a fourth in a row, I think we'll already be pretty disappointed with the direction of the season heading into the game. I think if Florida loses to Kentucky, I think it'll probably be Florida's third or fourth loss of the season already. That's just how I think about Kentucky right now, and that's kind of where I think Florida would be. I just don't think it's a good indication. It'll be an indication of a good season for Florida. Now, Florida could be trending in the right direction and still suffer a loss here. But a loss in this game, in my mind, probably ensures this season has been a disappointment up to that point.
Yeah, I think what you just said, though, there is one of the reasons why I don't pick Kentucky as the sort of fulcrum point for Florida for the schedule. As you said, that if they lose to Kentucky, then it means they've already got 3 or 4 losses, and 3 or 4 losses with what's coming after the Kentucky game means we're looking for a new head coach is really what it boils down to, whether they win that game against Kentucky or not, right? If they got 3 losses going to that Kentucky game, I think they've really got problems when it comes to what's coming in the future, irrespective of whether you think Ole Miss is a powder keg ready to explode or if FSU's not going to be as good as Uiagalelei. We've seen what happens when Florida gets off to bad starts and coaches are essentially already on the firing squad. And, I don't want to say quit, but the McElwain game against Georgia when everything leaked that he was out, the way Florida played against South Carolina when Dan Mullen was on the hot seat, and then against Missouri, those sorts of things, the way the seasons go downhill. To me, the Kentucky game maybe is the coroner, but not necessarily the murderer season if that goes on. I'll pick a week earlier. I think at Tennessee. I think there's a few reasons for that. One is everybody thinks the Vols are really good this year, so it's a little bit of a bellwether for where Florida sits. Florida's 17-2 in the last 19 meetings between these teams. Florida doesn't lose to Tennessee. So if you lose to Tennessee, again, I think that sort of goes to what you're talking about. But I think maybe that's Florida's second loss if they lose to Tennessee. And still heading into that gauntlet, to me, you're getting into that uncertainty zone that I don't like, where you're sitting there 6-6, 7-5, 5-7, going, well, maybe. And then the other thing is that you're coming off a game against KJ Jefferson, who just terrorized them last year. So if Florida's defense can stop Jefferson and Gus Malzahn with UCF, and then they can go on the road at night, most likely, I would guess, against Tennessee. And look, Nico Iamaleava, he completed less than 60% of his passes in high school his senior year. That doesn't profile well. And certainly Vol phenom quarterbacks have had a little bit of trouble against the Gators over the last, 3 decades. And so I think this is one of those where you're facing two very unique offenses. The Malzahn offense and then the Heupel offense are very different and they're very unique. And so if Florida can shut down both of those offenses back to back, I think that says a ton about Austin Armstrong, about Ron Roberts, about the transfers they brought in, and really what Florida needs to do. Because if you look at EPA per play or you look at EPA differential or any of those sorts of things, if Florida has the exact same offense in 2024 that they had in 2023 and their defense is just serviceable, slightly above average, you've got a team that's now snuck into the top tier of the SEC. And the only one of these teams on Florida's schedule to start with that would have been in the top tier of the SEC. Now, look, Georgia's way out there. Then there's a grouping of teams that kind of consists of Ole Miss, LSU, Tennessee, those sorts of teams. And then the next tier was Florida, Auburn, Mississippi State, Kentucky, those sorts of teams. And last year, at least, the tier 1 teams went 17-1 against the tier 2 teams. And so if Florida can sneak into that space, then beating Tennessee sort of indicates we've arrived as one of these tier 1 teams, assuming that you have the stuff I've talked about happening before, right? That you take care of business against Miami, that you looked good against UCF, all those sorts of things. So I sort of look at that Tennessee game as the one. If you drop that one and that's your second or third loss of the year, it's disaster. If you win that one and you've only got one loss or maybe even 0 losses heading into Kentucky, well, now we are having that conversation about we just got to get to 8-4. 8-4 and make the argument, 9-3 and you're in. And if you're having that argument coming out of that Tennessee game, to me, I think all of a sudden the recruits start looking at it and going, hey, Napier's going to be here for a long time. I think NIL, all the people who support that are now all of a sudden throwing in because they start buying into the vision. And look, we talk all the time about recruiting is about hope, and in college football, it's about preaching championships or winning championships and hope. And a win over Tennessee in this case, to me, gives the program a ton of hope heading into that Kentucky game. Now, obviously, if you then face plant against Kentucky, all that hope goes away. But as we saw last year, right? But to me, I would point to that Tennessee game. I almost always point to the Tennessee game, even when it's the third game of the year, as sort of the bellwether for where Florida's going to be. Obviously, Florida's had some rough patches the last few years, even though they've been able to take care of Tennessee. But name me a year where Florida lost to Tennessee where they had a great year, and you're
we just haven't lost to them that many years, so we can't do it too much.
Hey, that again, I look at it and say you can't.
That's kind of was like that was kind of my Kentucky argument, though.
But I go back to.
Yeah, I know what you're saying because of where it is.
Well, that, and then I also go back to the recruiting for Tennessee and Florida has been very, very similar. And so those are the teams you have to beat. Now, you got to beat Kentucky's too, because their recruiting hasn't been as good as yours. But when you get deeper into the season, look, Texas has out-recruited Florida. Georgia's out-recruited Florida. Ole Miss, at least in the transfer portal, based on what we think they have coming in, has probably out-recruited Florida. Florida State's kind of equivalent, and LSU's out-recruited Florida. So you start looking at those teams on the back end of the schedule, and you go, those are teams that a loss is like acceptable from a talent perspective. Now, it might not be acceptable because you should be bringing in better talent when you're in Florida, but at least from a roster and the Jimmies and Joes who are on the field, you go, okay, that team, you didn't get out schemed. If you start losing to Tennessee, UCF, Kentucky, now you're talking about getting out schemed. And I think that even bolsters the argument that everybody's making. And if you go look at the chat and YouTube, you'll see there are people who are already anti-Billy. So that bolsters those folks' arguments. And quite honestly, I think I agree with them at that point. If you for the third year in a row, if you're losing the teams who have less talent than you or equivalent talent to you, then what does it say about you as a coach? And I think Tennessee's about as close to Florida in terms of overall talent, the way the program's been built. Tennessee has that 5-star guy that they're trying to use at quarterback to offset the roster deficiencies that they have. It's really kind of like looking in a mirror. And the question is it a funhouse mirror or is it a mirror where, hey, all of a sudden Florida looks skinny and ready to go out to the club? We'll find out in Knoxville coming up, week 6 of the season.
Yeah. Going through probably a little small there, but I'll share some of the Discord thoughts. And MVP, nothing but positivity. He said Texas A&M, Will. Similar talent, similar questions, similar expectations. If Napier is going to be process, details, culture, he has to show the value of that by being ahead of year one Elko. Goldie Rogers says, I want to say Miami because that could set the tone for the season. That was going to be that's my second one. He goes, however, under Napier, a good or bad start against Utah the last 2 seasons led to bad records. He says, I'm going to say Kentucky. We should be 5-1 heading into that game. Napier needs to 6 wins before the difficult back half of the season. Gators in 15 says Tennessee. So there we go. Well, we got somebody agreeing with Kentucky, and we got somebody agreeing with Tennessee right here for us both. Gators in 15. Yeah. Gators in 15, he says Tennessee. He goes, assuming we're 5-0 by that time with the games we should win already, mostly by us. A Tennessee win already gets us bowl eligible and closer to 8 wins than 5. Chot says UCF or Kentucky. Can't lose either. Swagadelic says Miami for a few reasons. First game of the season. Number 2, it's a rival. 3, it's in-state, and we compete for the same recruits. 4, both programs are in similar spots with underperforming third-year coaches. And then John says it's Miami. Lose to Miami, and Napier is most likely cooked. It's pivotal for recruiting in-state. It's pivotal if this team has any hope of playing a bowl game. So thanks to Gators Breakdown Plus members. I threw the question in there to them earlier today. But, yeah, kind of echoing what we see here in the YouTube chat too. Cooley, of course, Billy better not lose to Miami because if he does, he might as well get a moving company and put his house for sale. Cooley also goes on to say to lose to Kentucky and we have more talent than them, that would be the end, no coming back. Thomas Moss brings up a good point, kind of going what we were just saying here. On the Discord side of things, you can say like 6 different games and you wouldn't be wrong. That is the nature of Florida's schedule this year. Of course, JC comes in and says, of course, when people were talking about this game or that game, JC says, I think it would depend on how bad the losses are. If it's procedural and mental errors like the past 3 years show zero improvement in football fundamentals, that will certainly go a long way in what people think about this team as well. So, yeah, good feedback there. Derek Powell says, yeah, hard to spin a narrative with L's to UCF, Kentucky, and Tennessee.